Good evening. Well, an enthusiastic crowd. I like that. Welcome to the 8th Durfee lecture series, and we're glad that you were able to come tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce the gentleman behind me, the Reverend Dr. Gary Eller. You can see through the brochure a little bit about his credentials. I knew Gary before I knew his credentials, and so I think that you might be interested in hearing a little bit about how we first met. Gary was the pastor of Providence Presbyterian Church in Matthews, North Carolina. This church was established in 1767. Are any of you remember when the Revolutionary War was? This church predates, and Gary was their minister. I was the student minister for a year, part of my doctoral studies with Union Theological Seminary, and so I did it at Providence, and Gary was not the pastor then, but shortly after I left, he became the pastor, and so someone who was from Charlotte, I got a chance to get to know Gary, and then he became the minister after several years at Trinity Presbyterian Church. And then Gary, I lost sight of him and in touch with him. And then I found out that Gary moved to Omaha, and Gary is the president of the Omaha Presbyterian Foundation, and got reintroduced to Gary. And when I'm with Gary, my southern accent comes out. But that's something that we're kind of proud of. But Gary got his PhD at Vanderbilt. And this is something I didn't understand at the time, but his dissertation was on Jonathan Edwards and a psychological study on Jonathan Edwards. And Gary was just telling me that Jonathan Edwards had a forgiveness problem. Can you imagine that? Because the congregation, after a while, ran Jonathan Edwards out of town. He was the one responsible for the Great Awakening. But the Puritans, they were not a group of people that forgave easily. And so you can imagine those kinds of issues. And so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards, but really about the subject of forgiveness, because I find that the church, we're very good about talking about forgiveness, but all of us understand how hard it is to practice it. And so one of the things I really appreciate from Gary, he's done the study not only theologically, but also psychologically, and will bring those insights to us. Though I'm mainly speaking to the choir and to our members, I do want to remind you of our Heritage Sunday service that will be coming up in 2 weeks on October 30th. And this is a great opportunity to invite your friends to this event when we celebrate our church heritage and our Scottish heritage. One other thing that we want to say is this lecture series is made possible by the money that was given to the church from Kent Durfee's estate. Kent Durfee loved the church, and Kent Durfee took out a life insurance policy which named the church as a beneficiary. But shortly after, he contracted cancer and he died from it. But this gift is a gift that keeps on giving, and we've had a proud tradition of having many kinds of speakers come and speak to us, to educate us at the intersection of life and faith. And so without further ado, I introduce to you my good friend, the Reverend Dr. Gary Eller.
It is a pleasure to be back here. 3.5 years ago, I was in this pulpit on Sunday that Brent was installed as pastor of the church. Been back 2 other times since then. It's the first incarnation of the church where I've seen the well. So the well was new to me. And I have started to draw from the well with great pleasure. So it's good to be back here with this particular people of God. See familiar faces and new faces as well. What I want to do tonight is to engage you in something that's very personal. And if I had my way about it, we would be in a circle and we'd be in somebody's living room and we would just be talking. So yes, it's a lecture, but it's really an invitation to self-reflection about your own life journey. Because what I want to do is to engage you with the subject of forgiveness, not as an abstract idea like flying at 35,000 feet, but I want to get you at ground level. I want to get you engaged with forgiveness as a Christian theme from the point of view of a participant observer, not merely an observer or an admirer of forgiveness in an abstract way. I was kind of half kidding with Brent a little while ago. I said, I really am concerned that if somebody is in the midst of a crisis of life where they're struggling with the issue of forgiveness, I just want to be sensitive to that, because you might be a person like that who, at this particular time in your own life, there is someone whom you're trying mighty hard to forgive and you're finding it difficult. Or you're somebody who really needs to receive the forgiveness of another person. Or you need to experience the forgiveness of God in a real and telling manner in order for your life to move ahead. You might be just right at that point. So what I'm going to say tonight is directed towards folks in a more experiential way than in a purely theological way. But my understanding of this is that that is the ground of all theology. It is the experience of what we talk about and the godness in that experience that is of the essence of who we are and what we seek to be in this world. Now, I'm going to follow the tradition of many who have gone before me and say, I am not an expert on forgiveness. I have read a lot about forgiveness. I have thought a lot about forgiveness. I have preached about forgiveness. I have done clinical work on forgiveness, all that kind of stuff. But as a person, as a human being, as an individual, it's a struggle. I, as other folks, have difficulty forgiving some people for some things, and that, quite honestly, is how I got interested in the topic. Where does the topic come from? Oftentimes, for folks, it comes from something they're working through in their own life, and for me, forgiveness is a big issue. I grew up as a Southern Baptist, like Brent did, so I always tell folks I'm a recovering Southern Baptist. I'm still trying. So forgiveness is a big issue if you grow up in that tradition. The forgiveness of Jesus Christ is something that you hear about every week when you're in church. But you're also told that you have to be a forgiver. You have to be a forgiver of other people. Because as Jesus forgave, you must forgive. And you may not expect forgiveness unless you yourself forgive. Now I throw that in there because that dynamic matters. Most folks are somewhat self-centered enough to say, well, if I forgive, then will I be forgiven? When you used to give blood at the Red Cross, and if you were a blood donor, then you could expect blood when you needed it, and they got a lot of donations, and then they kind of went away from that practice. And they said, well, you can give gallons of blood, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily will receive blood. there's not a one-to-one correspondence. Well, guess what? They got a lot fewer donors, okay? It's kind of like that with the forgiveness business. Forgiveness is hard. It's not easy. And it's very personal. And it may be something that you're working through as we gather here tonight. It may be something you struggle with for much of your adult and Christian life. And it's something that's not finished yet. So, with that preface, I'll share some things with you about the ways that others are looking at forgiveness, the way the church is approaching forgiveness, both the Presbyterian church and others, and tell you some stories, mostly true, but with the names changed to protect the so-called innocent parties along the way. Now, if that seems tolerable enough to you, then we've got to go. Is that workable? And then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So I'll ask you now to hold on to the good questions. I'll try to provoke some thoughts that will generate some questions among you. Start with a reflection. To yourself, who do you need to forgive? Who do you need to forgive? If for some reason this was your last night in this world, who do you need to forgive before you, move on? And in a similar manner, if this was your last night, who needs to forgive you? Who do you need to forgive? Who needs to forgive you? Whose forgiveness do you need? You have no doubt heard the proverb, to err is human, to forgive divine. Now, before you start thumbing the pew Bibles and wearing them out by the edges, that's not in the Bible. That's a poet, the Old English poet Alexander Pope. He's the one who wrote that line. It's not in the Bible. But he was essentially right. Whether the mistakes that we make are large mistakes, the big things, the biggies, or little ones that seem to come and go, we're just part of humanity if we make those. But the sticky point is that thing called the capacity to forgive the wounds that we have suffered, but to also acknowledge those wounds which we have inflicted. And how are we to make sense of the dilemma that forgiveness presents to us? Are there options? May we forgive some things and bypass others because, it's just too complicated, it's just too knotty to deal with, or it's somebody else's concern, it's not ours, and then that really big question that's so tough, is human forgiveness really possible? Is it really possible? We're all Christian people, probably here tonight. There might be somebody who isn't, but I doubt it. But if there is, Christians talk a lot about forgiveness. Is Christian forgiveness distinctive? Is there anything unique about Christian forgiveness as opposed to the so-called good person in the street? Is there anything that characterizes Christian forgiveness? Well, while you're thinking about these things, if you're a person who still likes to peruse the bookstores, any bookstore goer tours here, you like the brick and mortar kind that still have books on shelves and you can look at them and stuff, do you like to do that? If you go into those bookstores, or if you do the point and click variety at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other vendors, just plug into the search frame, if you're online, forgive or forgiveness. And you'll see lots and lots of books. A lot of people will tell you about forgiveness. What will they tell you? They will tell you that you should forgive. That sounds like a Sunday school lesson, right? We should forgive. Oh, yes, we should. And we should also always tell the truth. Oh, yes, we should. And then about forgiveness, they'll tell you all the reasons why you should always forgive and be a forgiving person, and they'll list them out for you. But you'll notice if you look at very many of those books in the self-help section or in the Christian life section, of a bookstore, they don't tell you much about how to do it. How do you go about doing it? What's involved in doing it? How do we get from being where we are to the other side of forgiveness? How do you deal with the anger that may be blocking that forgiveness, or the bitterness of how do you forgive somebody else? And how do we forgive ourselves, which can be the biggest forgiveness of all? Why do we have to suffer so much with this forgiveness? Why is it such a struggle? Why is it so difficult? Why isn't it just easy? It seems to be like an endless loop. There's so much. Have you noticed, I suspect you've been watching some of the presidential debates. You've heard tell of those. Kansas is in that, just like Nebraska and everybody else. We're looking at screens and we're listening to things. And boy, however it goes, a lot of forgiveness is going to have to happen sometime. Sometime, however it turns out. However. So many folks will tell you, if you're struggling with offering forgiveness to somebody, they'll tell you with a simple phrase, just get over it. Just move on. Take your feelings and forget them. Get over yourself. They don't give you permission to struggle the way that real people struggle with trying to forgive others. The church is not the only body talking about forgiveness these days. It's not just Sunday school class. It's not just sermons. It's not lectures and churches and stuff. Psychologists have rediscovered the forgiveness thing, and they're analyzing it. Philosophers are talking about the forgiveness thing. There's a whole cadre of folks who are the forgiveness people that are studying this emerging hot topic in our postmodern world. They are psychologists, they are philosophers, they are political scientists. There are all sorts of folks, in addition to theologians, who are talking about new developments and aspects of this phenomenon called forgiveness, because many say forgiveness has the potential for being the key issue of the 21st century. Forgiveness. The capacity to forgive, the quality, as some have called it, of forgiving-ness. That comes from John Patton, who was a pastoral theologian, now gone, taught for many years at Columbia Seminary. It is an important part of life lived in right relationship with God and also with one's fellow human beings. It's not something that's a program, like you eat these things and you're going to lose weight. You do these things and forgiveness will happen. It's not a one-to-one like that. Forgiveness is more complex. Forgiveness is an orientation to life. It's a way of being in the world. One might say that to be Christian is to be a forgiving person, and if you flip that around, you might say, if one is not forgiving, one is not a Christian person. Now, I told you I'd go to meddling with this. We're coming down from 35,000 feet. A number of years ago in Charlotte, a place that Brent knows as well, there it's called the Samaritan Pastoral Counseling Center. The Presbyterians and Methodists got together and had a counseling center. And I was working there for several years with folks who were individuals and couples who were having, shall we say, disagreements and issues. They were people who had heard that they should forgive one another, that they should forgive folks who had wounded them or slighted them, transgressed them in some way. But they weren't sure that it was possible. They often wondered aloud, Can I ever forgive so-and-so for whatever the thing was that had happened to them? I found that with many of these folks, one issue was shame. That shame and forgiveness are closely related. And that is that they were trying to bear the shame that was within them as they struggled with forgiveness. And that shame was interlaced with guilt. That where there was a struggle with forgiveness, there were also issues of personal shame and also a feeling of guilt for feeling ashamed and also guilt for not being able to forgive the other. I found this to be very common. Forgiveness or something like that they knew had to happen in their lives, but they didn't know how to make it happen. It just didn't come. They would reach for it, and it just wasn't there. One of the keys to all that was that forgiving is not a behavior. Forgiving's not like being polite. I get chided from time to time. I imagine Brent does as well, because I still hold doors for ladies. And sometimes I'll get stared at, like, don't do that. But we got trained at a certain time in our lives as Southern gentlemen to do that. Forgiving's not like being polite. It's not like that. Forgiving is much more a process than an action. And oftentimes, forgiveness is discovered in retrospect, or what they call looking through the rearview mirror. We discover that we have forgiven one. We have not given it specific and direct attention, but we've discovered something, that the one who has hurt us now no longer does, and that our relationship to them has shifted, and that we're now in a position to forgive, but we don't know quite how we got there. We still belong to the community of sinners, but we see them as part of God's children, not as somehow separated and different from, or an enemy, or an adversary. Who can forgive? Who can forgive? Joseph forgave his brothers. You know the story in Genesis? Joseph forgave his brothers. He gave them a little tweak, but he forgave them, right? Can we do that? Can we forgive? We say God forgives sins. Jesus says, who can forgive sins? But God. That's what they asked Jesus. Can we forgive? Forgiving is not for everybody. It's not something that's for everybody. I'm going to speak to that a little more specifically with some research that's just been developed in the last few years that's in the psychological literature that is now out there and generally available. And forgiveness has to be done the right way, has to be done in the right time, has to be done for the right reasons, and it has to be directed at the right person. But forgiveness is possible. Do you have to be a saint to forgive? No, you don't have to be a saint. But there are some things that are required. What's required? You knew there'd be requirements, didn't you? Well, there are some. You got to be somebody who bears some wounds. If you've lived any number of years, you bear some wounds. Any number of years, you bear some wounds. In this part of the country, I like to talk about Harry Truman. You remember old Harry Truman? Harry Truman had a feud with Eisenhower, with Ike. You know about that? Those fellas didn't get along. I know they were from neighboring states and all the rest. They didn't get along. One particular reason they didn't get along was that there was an incident in the early 1950s when General George Marshall, you remember him, the Marshall Plan in Europe? He was accused by Senator Joe McCarthy of being a communist dupe. Truman, let alone Marshall, took considerable exception to that idea. But Ike never contradicted what was said by McCarthy. At the age of 87, when Truman was being interviewed by Merle Miller for that book, Plain Speaking, that was a bestseller, at 87, Harry Truman said he'd never been able to forgive Ike for not sticking up for George Marshall against McCarthy. You need to know if you've been wounded. He certainly knew his friend had been wounded, and through his friend that he also had been wounded, and he was never able to forgive it, so much as we can tell. What else is needed? You got to know who wounded you, who did it. You can't be just wounded in general by the cosmos. You got to know who did it. And you got to have this push. It's kind of like an inner drive to forgive. You got to want to forgive. You don't just kind of wake up and stretch one morning and decide, oh, now I can forgive everything that's ever happened and everyone and all. It doesn't work that way. It's got to be a real wound. You got to know who did it, and you got to be willing to forgive and have the motivation to change it. All right, that sets the stage. There are a number of folks who have talked about these things that I would recommend to you. If you like books and stuff like that, I'd be glad to give you a bibliography, flash drive thing that I can send to Brent. Tell Brent you want the bibliography, and we can sell some books. Boom, no problem with that. But I'll mention some folks along the way and encourage you to take a look-see if you don't know these folks. One of them is a fellow now gone, whose name is Lewis Smedes. And Smedes taught at Fuller Seminary in California for a number of years. He was very interested in this forgiveness business because it was a struggle for him as well. His earliest book, Forgive and Forget, was a big seller, and then another one called The Art of Forgiveness. You find them in a lot of church libraries. They might well be here at the church. But he was a theologian from the Reformed tradition, and he liked to talk about the dynamics of forgiveness and what was necessary and how these things proceed. And his first question was, why should we forgive? Why do it? I mean, it's not easy, so why do it? Well, you see, he was convinced that if we can forgive, it really makes life easier. It makes life easier. You remember the old song about why you shouldn't tell lies, because then you don't have to remember everything you've said all the time, you know? Well, forgiving's kind of like that. If you forgive, life will be easier for you. Revenge is really hard. Revenge extracts a toll from you. It works against you. And the health people will tell you it's also not good for you. It'll make you sick. Forgiving is also a better risk than revenge. Having a redemptive orientation to the world is a better way to get up in the morning and start your day than trying to figure out how you're going to get even with somebody you just can't stand. However appealing that may be on some days, I understand. It's also a stronger response than holding on to old hatreds. You got to remember them all. Have you ever been in an argument where you can't remember how it started or who started or what it's really about? Sometimes I found that that's true even with family members. You know, kids who now are adults but live in other parts of the country, and before I communicate with them, you know, like you can do so easily through the internet these days, I have to think to myself almost out loud, what was the last thing that I heard from them? Let's see now, are they happy or are they not happy with me? Are we arguing about anything or are we on good terms? And then I'll write out whatever the thing is. I have to think about it. That's a labor that you can bypass. Forgiving is also appropriate because we are all, as Reformed folks say, fraught with sin. We are faulty people. We are faulty people, and we forgive others because we know ourselves to be sinful and need to be forgiven. Those are some pretty good reasons to forgive. You will also frequently hear it said that we should simply forget. I will say at more than one point tonight, forgetting is not forgiving. Indeed, forgetting can prevent true forgiving from ever really occurring. You don't want to just forget. You want to forgive. And there are two very different things. So this forgiving business, there are 4 stages to it. These are rough. Generally, though, they apply to folks. There are qualifications, of course. But the first is simply that you have experienced some injury, some hurt. If you're an adult person, no doubt you have at some point in your life. Somebody said the wrong thing, somebody did the wrong thing, all that, And you're experiencing some difficulty as a result of it. You have some pain. That may be an internal pain that nobody else sees. You may keep it to yourself, but it's real. And it's personal. When a cyclone tears through Kansas and Nebraska, we don't forgive nature. We don't forgive things in nature, but we forgive persons. Forgiveness has to do with personal relationships. Forgiving has to do also with pain that's felt to be unfair. Somehow we've been wronged. We've been hurt in some way by somebody else's intention to injure us, or some spillover from their own problems. We've been hurt maybe by their good intentions or by their mistakes. But however it happened, we've experienced the pain as unfair. And so there's a forgiveness dynamic that kicks in. And the pain itself is deep. That is to say, we get injured in all kinds of little ways that are like paper cuts, and forgiveness is not involved with that. Small things, annoyances, slow elevators, slights. We don't get really quick service in a restaurant. Disappointments. The movie's not as good as the critics all said it was going to be. Coming in second. I almost got that thing, but somebody else got it instead at work. Those are not things that need forgiving. But there are things that are deep that do. And unless they're forgiven, we are truly wounded. Some of those. Disloyalty. Counting on someone to be loyal and then discovering that that person has not been, or a near kin to that, betrayal, or a near kin to that, brutality and abuse. These are things that have to be forgiven. They have to be forgiven because they are deep and wounded. Feel for yourself. You can tell for yourself whether something is an annoyance or if it truly is something that needs to be forgiven. Annoyances we forget about, deep wounds we do not. Second stage of forgiving after the hurt, there's the hate and the anger. And I use that strong word hate. Anger that wells up and becomes hate. There's a phrase that Lou Smedes used about this dynamic. He said, hate is a tiger snarling in the soul. A tiger snarling in your soul. That's a ferocious image. Hate is a hard sickness to cure. It is people, not merely evil, that we hate. We can't truly manage the old bromide. Most people can't. To hate the sin and love the sinner. If you can do that, we will make you tonight a candidate for sainthood. Most people will say that, but they can't really do it. If they hate the sin, they don't really love the sinner. Very, very rarely are they able to manage that. Hatred is aimed. Hatred is targeted at people. Targeted at people with a purpose. It is a targeted hatred which we hold towards someone who has offended us, who has hurt us, that is in need of forgiveness. Otherwise, it's a wound that will not heal. Ironically, we don't usually hate strangers. You know, you got to know somebody well enough to really hate them, you know. We get angry at strangers. We get annoyed with strangers. You know, somebody who cuts you off in traffic, you know. Somebody who only gives you one scoop instead of 2 scoops of ice cream, you know, at Ben & Jerry's, you know. But we actually only hate people whom we know really well, usually. And it's hate for people we love which makes us sick. Hate for the people whom we love that makes us sick. Human beings are just wired that way. We are very unusual creatures. Let me tell you a few things that forgiveness is not. The title for this could be Some Nice Things That Forgiveness Is Not, that Forgiving Is Not. Forgiving is not forgetting. Let's talk about that one again a minute. If you just forget, you probably will never forgive at all. The pains that we experience do not just mysteriously go away in some magical fashion if we forget. If we have a blank on the screen where there used to be an image or an incident. Forgetting is not forgiving. In fact, forgetting is an avoidance of forgiveness. Being Southern Baptist, I have to quote a Bible verse to you. The Bible says God promises to forgive us and forget. Yes, the Bible does say that in Jeremiah. It says specifically, I will forgive their sins and will remember their sins no more. But that's God. That's not us. Does God, you suppose, forget the way we forget when we misplace the car keys? Probably not. God doesn't have amnesia, after all. To say, as the prophet Jeremiah does, that God forgets is to say that God feels almost the way that God would feel if God had forgotten. If God had forgotten. But we have the power to forgive while we still remember, and to trust and believe that God will then forgive us. Forgiving is not forgetting. What else is it not? It's an old French proverb. It has to do with excusing and forgetting. The French proverb goes like this. It's not in the Bible. To understand everything is to forgive everything. To understand everything is to forgive everything. And that's not really true either. We only excuse all if we understand all. It takes no saving grace to excuse someone. Just a little insight, you know, stand in their shoes, walk a mile in their shoes, that kind of thing. Excusing is not forgiving. Forgiving is a much more fundamental exercise than excusing. Excusing is on the level of being polite. Forgiving is on that foundational level of being itself. Forgiving is not the same as smothering conflict. You've heard of smother love, any of you moms, grandmoms here? You've heard of smother love, right? You know how parents sometimes will try to smooth things over and soothe the child and say, look, now, you know, patting them on the head, literally or figuratively, patting them on the head and say, just let it go, it'll be fine, just, you'll see. Also implying, I can't stand the conflict, I don't want any trouble, I don't want all the noise, and I don't want an argument for crying out loud, just let it go, let it pass, you know. Smothering conflict is not forgiveness. A sin of many clergy who are conflict avoidant, or the clergy who try to pretend like there is no conflict when there obviously is one. Oh, there's no conflict in our church. There's no difficulty there. Everybody agrees with everyone else. Everyone's always happy. Never a cross word is said on these grounds. If you know that church, let's all rush there and join it, right? Okay? That's not forgiveness either. Just accepting people is not forgiving them. Some folks believe acceptance and forgiveness are the same thing. They're not. Acceptance and forgiveness may feel a lot alike, but they're not the same. We accept people because of the good people they are for us. You know, I rather like someone who is a good auto mechanic, especially when there's something wrong with my car. I accept him as a certified auto mechanic. I'm not forgiving him of anything. We forgive people, though, when there's something bad that happens that's directed towards us from them. So to put it another way, we accept people for the good that they are, but we forgive people for the bad things they do. Forgiving is not tolerance. A lot of well-intentioned, good Christian people believe that it is. If they can put up with it, they feel like they have sufficiently forgiven it. They are not the same thing. Tolerating everything somebody does may or may not be appropriate, and it's not the same thing as forgiving. You can forgive someone most anything, some things, but you can't tolerate everything, can you? You can't put up with everything. So let's just take a little summary of these. You don't have to forget after you forgive, to put it differently. You may, but your forgiving can be sincere even if you remember the incident. You're not called upon to forget it. You don't excuse people by forgiving them. You forgive them only because you hold them to account and you refuse to merely excuse them. And you don't forgive people by somehow smothering conflict. If you forever smother people's differences, you rob them of the opportunity to actually forgive. And you don't forgive people merely by accepting them. You forgive people who have done something to you that is unacceptable. And forgiveness is not toleration. You may forgive them, but still not tolerate what they've done. Now, that's a chunk. That's a handful of things. I want you to have those in mind. I'm going to mention to you a few folks here and encourage you to take a look-see at what they have written. It's not just Smedes. If you want to engage somebody who has written tellingly about these things that's readily available, and you want to see forgiveness on a little broader scale, many of you will know the name Desmond Tutu. We've got a lot of folks here who remember Desmond Tutu. You're mindful of him? He's written a book about forgiveness. Did you know that? The title out is The Book of Forgiving. The subtitle is The Fourfold Path for Healing Ourselves and Our World. It was published last year. Desmond Tutu. Okay? In that book, he has a fourfold path to forgiveness. He says, we will heal the world by healing each and every one through forgiveness. This is the fourfold path. Tutu says, we begin by telling our story, naming the hurt, granting forgiveness, and then releasing and renewing. Release the person, release the hurt, release the pain, and renew ourselves, renew our souls. And he applies this not only to individual lives, but to corporate lives, community lives, nations, and their interactions with one another. You might want to take a look. Desmond Tutu, 2015, The Book of Forgiveness. Let's talk a minute about what psychologists think they have discovered about forgiveness. Let's say that there is a capital F forgiveness. Capital F forgiveness has to do with a major life trauma, a big deal. Involves a profound life change. Someone has been violated in some fundamental way. And then there is the small f forgiveness, the lowercase forgiveness. And that has to do with disappointments and transgressions and things that just didn't work out, in the heat of the moment, and the kind of things that happens in families and friends and all sorts of business exchanges and, even in churches, let it be said. Okay, small f forgiveness. These two types of forgiveness are being closely studied. What they are and how they are related to one another, as well as the effects of this type of forgiveness, capital F or small f forgiveness, on people. And a lot's being discovered about forgiveness and being a forgiver and receiving forgiveness and how it changes our lives. One of the things which is a takeaway that I want you to remember. So you say, what did that guy talk about? Talked about 45 minutes. No. What did that guy talk about? He said, if you can forgive, it will improve your health. It's got that little self-interest tweak. If you can forgive, you'll be healthier. He said that. Yeah, he did. Well, I'm not the only one saying that. Here are some things that are being discovered about forgiveness by the psychologists. There may be such a thing as a forgiving personality type. You may be one of those. You may not be one of those. A forgiving personality type is someone who has the inclination, the habits, the habitus of forgiveness. It's like they've got another sense for things that not everybody has. In like manner, there seem to be folks who will always struggle with forgiving somebody else. Now, the cultural popular term you hear all through lots of ways these days is the narcissistic personality, the self-centered person, the person that's in the world for themselves, and all that stuff. Person who characteristically has a sense of entitlement and grandiosity, need for admiration of others, has a high self-opinion, lack of empathy for others, etc. The psychologists call that narcissistic personality disorder. Okay? A person who is diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder is going to have a really hard time with forgiving because they won't see the need. They won't feel the need. They won't have the empathy. And they'll have a hard time receiving forgiveness from somebody else because what did they ever do that would need to be forgiven, for crying out loud, So the psychologists are saying that there are personality types, some of whom may be well inclined to forgive and able to do it, and others who will struggle mightily and just not be able to get there. So as I look out tonight and I see a group of wise church folks in front of me, when the church then on Sunday morning says, forgive because Jesus says we should forgive, and in our congregations there are folks of both types, the forgiving personality type and the type that finds it very, very hard to forgive, those words are going to sound very different to those different sorts of folks. The forgivers will be able to forgive because that's what they do. But the folks who are not forgivers, they'll still find it very hard to forgive or to receive forgiveness, no matter how the sermon is preached. That's one thing. Two, as Augustine found out with his own confessions, his autobiographical confessions in the 5th century, confession is linked to forgiveness. I don't know if anybody here grew up Catholic or was Catholic until fairly recently. For a number of years, I've taught with the Jesuits at Creighton, so I'm kind of in tune to some of their stuff. Well, this is really a very ancient and Christian thing, and the psychologists are now saying it's true. Confession and forgiveness are closely related. There is a link between repentance, one's own purging of the soul, and the ability to see somebody else in a different light and be able to forgive something that was done to you by this other person where you feel like you're the victim. The person who is unable or out of practice with repentance doesn't do much forgiving either. Doesn't see much need for forgiveness. It's not part of their jargon, part of their regular habit of faith. A person who is in a confessional mode, some of you may journal, or some of you journal writers, you do spiritual journals, or at least periodically you journal. You have times of the day which are prayer times for you. You have scriptures that you read. You have meditations that you do. You're in a prayer group. You have habits of confession. If you have habits of confession, the psychologists are saying you're more likely to be a forgiving person. It kind of is a C prompt for forgiveness. Marriage and forgiveness. Careful now. Marriage and forgiveness. When we marry someone who has a history with forgiveness, either receiving it or not receiving it, extending it or not extending it. They also have a history they bring of trust and betrayal from earlier relationships. That long-term history of trust and or betrayal will have a lot to do with how forgiving they will be in the marriage relationship. If they have had a violated sense of trust in their prior close familial relationships, they will bring that into the marriage with them, and their relationship is almost surely to be impacted by it, and their marriage as well. It can't be ignored any more than post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that. Marriage and forgiveness. Can marriage partners truly be partners? Only if they understand what they bring to the relationship with regard to forgiveness. Fourth thing, this is from the psychologists. Forgiveness develops across the human lifespan. Develops. We learn how to forgive some things when we're kids, but we also continue to build on those experiences. And if we successfully build upon those earlier experiences and there's sufficient trust engendered in our spirits, then we can ascend to higher levels of personal and social maturity, which lend themselves towards being more forgiving, more broadly forgiving in the way that we relate to other people. So much so that the elderly, now I'll be 66 in December, so I know that's a kid to some of you and it's old to some of you, so that's the way it goes, you know. But the elderly, let's say all those folks who are getting the AARP stuff, that'd be a lot of folks, right? The elderly may be more likely to forgive than youthful folks. Maybe. Based on a lifespan view of the capacity to forgive as being developmentally encouraged and grown. So adolescents, young, middle-aged adults may not have so great a capacity as their elders to forgive. The frequency and quality of forgiveness may change at different times in our lives, so much so that psychologists say that the capacity to forgive evolves over the human life course. It evolves. Test that out against your own experience. It can. How about spirituality and forgiveness? Specifically spirituality. I'll share with you a quote from John Patton again. Forgiveness is best understood as a part of a larger process of living. What is needed is to enlarge the frame of their life picture. Forgiveness is one element in the greater process of dealing with a shamed and estranged self. Forgiveness is an ability to recognize the humanness of one's injurer as well as discovering one's own humanity. And that, he says, is a spiritual process. It's an illustration of a quality of life when it's lived in relation to God and one's fellow human beings. So forgiveness is not something that happens in isolation. Forgiveness is part of the entire tapestry of a human life. Think of your life as a tapestry. Where are the threads of forgiveness in the tapestry of your life? And where are the gaps? Where are the gaps? A few weeks ago, we came across the 15th anniversary of 9/11. I was in West Virginia on 9/11, a small church in West Virginia doing an interim ministry. And like many of you, I discovered that things were happening and ran to a TV screen, and we closed the church office and sent everybody home, and folks scurried and didn't know quite what to do. And that night we had a gathering of the churches at the Presbyterian church, and we had a community prayer service, and we didn't really know all that had happened, but we knew that some bad things had happened, and we knew there was a lot of trouble, and it was a long way from being over. So a few weeks ago, the World Herald asked me to write an article, and this is an excerpt from the article about that experience that touches on this theme of forgiveness with a capital F. The title of the piece was called A Deep Silence, and this is an excerpt. There are not many occasions when you experience silence in our world. Things are much too frantic, too 24/7 for genuine quiet. So when there is a public occasion for silence, it's a rare event. When the 15th anniversary of 9/11 came this past Sunday, there were a host of services of remembrance. There were commemorative events held in parks and churches and malls and colleges, all kinds of places. Many of the services included a speaker who offered a verbal reflection on 9/11, as well as what we have discovered as a nation since 2001. Many compared 9/11 to Pearl Harbor Day, or November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. As with those other momentous days, most people could recall exactly where they were when they heard the news and how they reacted. It was not at all unusual to see someone crying in the crowds who attended the 9/11 services even 15 years after the horrific events. In a society as diverse as 21st century America, there are few ways to speak eloquently to everyone, so perhaps that's why the so-called moment of silence has become such a fixture in public expressions of grief and remembrance. Sometimes that moment is so short that it fails to allow for even a breath or two before the next activity is engaged. The band plays on, the game begins, and the moment passes. That was not the case with the 9/11 memorials. More time was allowed for silence, enough time to engage the moment more fully and to re-experience the memories and the loss. Crowds were much more respectfully quiet. In fact, the silence was often prolonged and profound enough that it became a deep silence. And in that moment of utter stillness, much healing was done, for it was a holy time. Forgiveness. It's the theme of the 21st century.